Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on key advertising law issues in the Caribbean. And on behalf of GALA, the Global Advertising Lawyers Alliance, welcome everyone from wherever you're joining us. We're in for a bit of a treat today. We have a number of Caribbean advertising lawyers that will be dealing with various topics. And my name is Dianne Daley McClure, and I am the partner for Foga Daley. I deal with intellectual property. With us today, we have Mandisa and Stephanie from Trinidad and Tobago, and they are with Fitzwilliam, Stone, Furness-Smith, and Morgan. We will have Rachael Lodge Corrie, who is from my firm as well. We will have Karyl Bertrand from Bertrand Legal, and she will be speaking and covering the Dutch Caribbean. We'll have Maristella Collazo Soto from Ferraiuoli, and she will be talking from the perspective of Puerto Rico. And we have Jaime from AngelesPons from the Dominican Republic. Now, if you have any questions for us, you can type those in the chat section and to everyone so that we can see the questions, or you can put a direct question to an individual panelist, or you can use the Q&A feature directly addressing your question to the speaker. So to start us off, first of all, let me just highlight the topics for you. We're going to be looking at legal do's and don'ts in advertising. We're going to be talking about sweepstakes and promotions. Also, the use of celebrities and athletes' images in advertising, native advertising, and social media marketing. So to start us off, we will have Stephanie, who will be looking at legal do's and don'ts in advertising in the jurisdiction of Trinidad and Tobago. Remember, type a question in the chat or in the Q&A section. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you, Dianne. Yes, thank you, Dianne. Okay, so there are general advertising requirements in Trinidad and Tobago. There are two specific advertising standards locally. These are the general requirements and specific standards with relation to children. Now, these standards are voluntary and they're regulated by the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards. And notwithstanding the fact that these standards are voluntary, which means that they don't have force of law, we still tend to find that they represent best practice so that local advertisers usually adhere to the different standards. It's also important to note that these particular standards do not apply to certain types of goods. So food, cosmetics, drugs, pesticides, and toxic chemicals are actually regulated by entirely separate regimes. So it's important to note for Trinidad and Tobago purposes that you need to consider the products in question, because you have two sorts of streams. The first stream is regulated by the TPBS, the general products, and then the second stream is regulated actually by the Chemistry, Food and Drug Division, which handles the products I just mentioned: food, drugs, pesticides, toxic chemicals, etc. So let's have a look at the do's of advertising. Advertising materials should comply with national legislation. So in addition to these standards, there are several pieces of legislation which heavily regulate certain products. For example, tobacco, financial services, alcohol. You find that there are specific pieces of legislation which would speak to the advertising, the packaging, and the labeling that is required for the product. So the takeaways that you can't look at a standard in isolation. You need to look at the standard together with other underpinning pieces of legislation. So even though the standard is voluntary, it may be that there is a complementary piece of legislation elsewhere, which would actually make certain provisions mandatory under the law. Advertising materials should also be include genuine testimonials and endorsements, comply with accepted norms of public decency, and respect human dignity. Now, Trinidad and Tobago is a fairly conservative society, so that advertisers or local advertisers tend to aim more towards the side of conservatism. That's something that you'd want to bear in mind when thinking about publishing a certain ad in Trinidad. And advertising material should be accurate with respect to price, quality, claims, and other matters. Next slide, please. So doing. Advertisements shall not contain material which, among other things, provokes violence, unlawful or obscene behavior, discriminates against age, race, ethnicity, origin, class, religion, gender, disability, or place of residence. And we're going to get an advertisement shortly, a live example of a situation which would have addressed that particular matter. Advertising material also should not mislead consumers, should not discredit another's goods or services unless there is factual substantiation, and should not use the person's image or property unless their permission is obtained. Dan, if you could just go back for one more, please. Thank you. Okay, so I want to particularly zoom in on discredit another's goods or services unless there's factual substantiation. So that sort of touches and concerns comparative advertising locally. And comparative advertising is actually permissible in Trinidad and Tobago under very strict confines. So long as the advertisement or the comparative advertising is fair and it does not discredit another person's goods to the extent that they is not factual substantiation, then you cannot use the comparative material. And factual substantiation means that you need to have documentary evidence to support you. And the documentary evidence has to be objectively viewed. And also it needs to be able to withstand the scrutiny of some sort of, for example, if the advertisement is taken before the High Court, it needs to be able to withstand the scrutiny of the High Court insofar as the material being objective. Next slide. So this is the recent controversial ad in Trinidad and Tobago, which I was discussing earlier. And this is KFC's Black Power advertisement. And you need to look at this ad within the broader context of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. Towards the first half of last year, in 2020. So you had this great upsurgence in social inequality and rioting. And then that would have then trickled down to the Caribbean and then to Trinidad and Tobago. And then KFC publishes this Black Power ad, allegedly in support of Emancipation Day. Now, it created quite an uproar locally because many people were of the view that the ad was actually very racially insensitive. Because if you see here, it depicts a fried chicken leg in the foreground, and then a picture of a raised fist in the background, which is synonymous with the civil rights movement and the African liberation struggle. And you had the Emancipation Committee of Trinidad and Tobago actually harshly speaking out against it. And there was a lot of social media discourse. And eventually KFC had to pull the ad, and they pulled it very swiftly within a day of publication. And then they issued an apology. And in this particular case, the regulator, being the Chemistry, Food and Drug Division, didn't even have to step in at all. And it shows that this case shows that pressure from a Trinidad and Tobago public, might be very effective in having an ad removed. So you have to be very mindful of the material that you put in the ad and the audience. Trinidad and Tobago public can be very vocal when they are not pleased about a particular subject matter. Next, Dianne. So I want to look at quickly specific advertising standards for children. So as I mentioned, there are two standards, the general, and now there are these specific ones for children, which are voluntary. Now, notwithstanding the fact that these standards are voluntary, again, they have legislative underpinning in the Children's Act. So the Children's Act would regulate what material can be appropriate for children. And let's look quickly at the do. Advertising material should, and I want to specifically look at be appropriate for a child audience when aired outside the hours of 10 p.m. and 5 p.m. Now, the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards would have highlighted that particular window of time, sort of late night, early morning, where child viewership would deem to be less. So in that particular case, ads published at that time are generally not as heavily regulated as ads published outside of that period where child audience is generally accepted to be higher, and therefore you find the ad more heavily regulated in terms of what is appropriate content. Let's look at the don'ts of advertising material. Advertisements, should not include any material that contains drugs, food supplements, etc., geared towards children. Next, please, Dianne. Encourage children to eat unhealthy foods. And I want to take a closer look at number 3 on this particular slide. Depicts well-known children's characters endorsing products except in public health, safety, and education campaigns. In this particular matter, you cannot have a character which is well known publicly endorsing your particular product. So you can, however, use a character which is created for your particular product, but you cannot use a character which is known globally for children, for example, Dora the Explorer, Peppa Pig, because that is deemed to be an endorsement, and those are specifically reserved for those particular types of campaigns for a public initiative. So the takeaway from this presentation is that yes, standards are voluntary, but there are several pieces of legislation which underpin standards, for example. So you need to bear in mind, it's not only standards that you're looking at, but you need to be very specific about the product that you're looking at. You need to seek legal advice with respect to the product that you want to have advertised locally, because it may be that they are enforceable provisions under separate pieces of legislation. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. I don't see anything in the chat, so I'm going to move on to Rachael, who will talk about Jamaica legal do's and don'ts.
Thank you. So a lot of the do's and don'ts kind of overlap with Trinidad, so we'll just look at them quickly. These are some of the pieces of legislation that govern advertising in Jamaica. I won't read them all, they're there for you to see, but just to point out that the Jamaican Code of Advertising Practice, the Children's Programming Code, and the Code of Marketing Communication Practices for Beverage Alcohol Products are all self-regulatory codes that we tend to rely on, but we do follow them as if they were pieces of statute. Next slide, right. So some do's, of course, you have to comply with all the relevant national legislation, avoid mislabeling, misrepresentation, any misleading acts. Your ads should be decent, honest. And if you, in an advertisement, promise a delivery date for a product, you have to comply with that delivery date. Otherwise, there are penalties involved. Testimonials and endorsements are allowed, but again, you have to be using genuine people that you can say are reasonable to speak about the products. And if your ads are based on fictional characters, then you have to make sure that they don't give the impression that these are real people giving a testimonial. Puffer is allowed, so where you have obvious exaggeration that's meant to amuse or draw attention, that's permissible, but again, it can't be done in a way that you're claiming that your product is superior or better than a competitor or giving some unrealistic comparisons. Likewise, comparative advertising is permissible for the benefit of healthy competition, but you have to ensure again that you're not conferring an unfair disadvantage to a competitor. And in our case, the Code of Advertising Practice actually prohibits you from taking unfair advantage of a competitor's name or their trademarks, any symbols that they use. So what we find in Jamaica is that companies tend to shy away from directly comparing their products with another competitor, but they'll do it in ways that are more subtle, but clearly taking a shot at a company that you can clearly guess who they're going after. So just by way of example, I think we all remember this Popeye's chicken sandwich craze. Here in Jamaica, we were seeing the lines in the US for people lining up for these chicken sandwiches, and we just kept wondering what all this hype was about. And so when Popeyes decided, okay, they're going to launch the chicken sandwich here in Jamaica, every week they started putting these ads on Instagram. So, you know, something's coming, it's what you've been waiting for. Next slide. And then every week they're just building up to revealing the chicken sandwich is coming to Jamaica. And then when it finally came, and go to the next slide, please. All right, so they finally announced, and this was weeks of talking and talking about this chicken sandwich, and everybody wanted to know what this hype is about. In response, Wendy's kind of just said, okay, enough talking about it, let's talk more taste. Without directly referencing Popeyes, it was very clear who they were referencing in this matter. And just an example again of ways that these companies speak to each other without actually calling any names. This is a picture near our office where there's a Popeyes, and right above it, there's a billboard for KFC, and it constantly, every ad on this billboard, it's one of those rotating billboards, and every single ad on it is a KFC ad. It just keeps changing to different KFC ads. Some don'ts, of course, you cannot be having misleading advertisements. Don't advertise products or services for a price if you have no intention to offer them at this price, or if you doubt that these goods or services can be supplied. Don't advertise anything which claim to improve any racial characteristics. No advertisements for any drink that suggests that it can contribute to your sexual prowess. No material that is obscene or anything that would lead or lend support to criminal or illegal activity or appear to condone any of that. Nothing which supports any illegal activity, and nothing that without justifiable reason plays on the fear of the public, and nothing to exploit the superstitious. Anything related to children, again, like Trinidad, there are specific considerations for children. Don't try to exploit them to believe that if they don't earn a certain product, then they're inferior to others, or nothing offensive or demeaning to people based on their gender, race, religion, culture, sexual orientation, or other group. So some industries have specific advertising standards. Food, of course, is one. No misleading ads for food or drinks, drugs. The legal profession has specific advertisements. So does the other professional industries such as insurance agents and accountants. Next. Alcohol, of course, has specific standards as well. You can't make ads that present abstinence or drinking in moderation in a negative way. You can't address these ads to anyone under 18. And again, tobacco, and these of course are for health reasons. All tobacco products have to come with a health warning, and there's no allowance for television or radio ads for tobacco products. Likewise, any commercial broadcaster is not allowed to have these advertisements for tobacco products, and all of this is in the interest of public health. Right, so that's it for me.
Thanks, Rachael. We're moving pretty fast. We're going to go now to the Dutch Caribbean, and Karyl will give us sort of a little landscape and the legal do's and don'ts. Over to you, Karyl.
Dianne. The Dutch Caribbean is in the advertising. As we can see, the Dutch Caribbean is not one single jurisdiction, but there are 4 countries in the Dutch Caribbean. These are still non-independent countries in the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So the official language is Dutch, although English is recognized as an official language in the Dutch Caribbean islands, and Spanish is also widely spoken in the 3 islands, Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire. The 4 jurisdictions of the Dutch Caribbean are Aruba, Curacao, Saint Martin up in the northeast, and then the Dutch part of Saint Martin, because there's also a French side, but the Dutch Saint Martin is the 3rd country, and the 4th country of the Dutch Caribbean consists of Bonaire, Saint Eustatius, and Saba, that are also called the BES, the Best Islands. These countries are quite multicultural and multilingual. The official language, as I noted, in all of the countries is Dutch, English in some of them, and Papiamento is the native language of Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire. Seeing that these are Dutch territories, the laws in the Dutch Caribbean are based on Dutch law. But that does not mean that Dutch law is automatically applicable to all of these countries, because they have their own laws. The European directives are not necessarily applicable directly. So in some instances, they might apply indirectly. The Dutch Caribbean islands do not have a general advertising law. So the advertising provisions are scattered across the various laws that we have, depending on what you will be advertising, what kind of product. If it's pharmaceuticals, consumer products, you'll be advertising, or the platform that you will be using to advertise these products. So if it's via radio, television, or via electronic means. The Dutch Caribbean, they have a general provision for misleading advertising in the Civil Code. So basically, advertisements in the Dutch Caribbean must be true and honest. And besides that, we also look towards general internationally accepted standards and good practices regarding, for instance, non-discrimination and decency. There is no general regulator in the Dutch Caribbean. So mostly we would have, depending on the specific law, that would be either a government or a semi-government entity. And of course, if there's an aggrieved party through an advertisement, they are also free to aid the court. Of course, in advertisements, you must also respect the laws of intellectual property, and image rights are also protected in the Dutch Caribbean, and privacy. As mentioned, there are specific laws for packaged pharmaceutical products. Advertisements are in principle allowed in most of the Dutch Caribbean countries, unless prohibited by ministerial decree. Aruba has a different provision. So advertisements are in principle not allowed unless permission is obtained from the inspector of pharmaceuticals. Off-label promotion is not allowed in the Dutch Caribbean. Important to note that usually the provisions for consult your physician and read directions before purchasing or use of a pharmaceutical product must be in the local language and the language used in the advertisement. The local language in Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao is Papiamentos. So most people speak Papiamentos, so such a claim must also be in Papiamento. Also, special prohibitions apply. For instance, for persons taking medications may not be depicted in the ads regarding pharmaceutical products, nor the use of celebrities, nor children using adult medication. Regarding the platform for advertising, there are special provisions regarding alcohol and tobacco. So there is the television ordinance and decree, and that has special provisions regarding strong alcoholic beverages that are consist of 21% or more alcohol. And also in the broadcasting license of radio and television media, there's also a special requirement regarding alcohol and tobacco advertisements. Those may not be aimed at minors and may only be broadcasted between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. But there is exemption possible from the government. If you will be advertising on billboards, then there is special provisions that also apply. So it's only possible with prior permission or exemption from the government, and of course the owner or the lessee of the property. And the government may attach conditions to the permission granted. And person-to-person advertising is allowed, but is not allowed if public order is disrupted, threatened, or it is morally insulting. So that is it for me for a general landscape for the legal do's and don'ts.
Thank you so much, Karyl. Maristella will talk about advertising essentials in Puerto Rico.
Thank you so much, Dianne. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. The first important note we like to talk about in terms of advertising in Puerto Rico is that we have dual regulation in place. For those of you that don't know, Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States of America. And in terms of advertising, we have our local regulations and local government entities that regulate advertising, but we are also bound by federal regulations and federal government agencies. Specifically, the Lanham Act, approved in 1946 by the United States Congress, which regulates false advertising in the United States at the federal level, applies to all advertising made in Puerto Rico. And the Federal Trade Commission, which is the government entity charged with managing the regulation of false advertising, also has jurisdiction within Puerto Rico. In addition, Puerto Rico has a local statute called the Trademark Act of Puerto Rico, which includes regulations for false advertising. And we have a local regulatory entity, which is the Department of Consumer Affairs. Its initials in Spanish are DACO, and they are the local entity that have jurisdiction over advertising and false advertising matters. So this dual regulation is critical when making strategies as to advertising in Puerto Rico. I also want to point out that we are very strong against deceptive advertising. And what is understood to be deceptive advertising is any advertisement that is done with a measurable or verifiable fact that is not substantiated by evidence. Okay, so every time we're going to claim an allegation of a fact that can be verified or substantiated, we need to have evidence of some type to support that, be that surveys, if that's what's applicable, or empirical data. So that's very important in the local arena for advertising. Puffery is our exception to that, which has already been touched upon by several of my colleagues, but puffery is exaggerations that no reasonable consumer would take as serious, and that is an exception to false advertising that is unsubstantiated. So that's, you know, big picture what matters in terms of false advertising. But I wanted to bring up, and that's the slide that you're looking at, in terms of testimonials or some sort of ad made by customers. The FTC has been very stringent in saying that when you're making an ad about a product or a service specifically, you can't include a disclosure that says results not typical is sufficient or adequate, because that will be a violation of federal and local regulations concerning false advertising. The results have to be applicable to the average type of consumer that will buy the product or use the service. So the results not typical is something absolutely not acceptable in the Puerto Rico jurisdiction for ads. I include here various examples, mostly about weight and image, because those are the most dramatic and where most consumers get duped into buying some sort of product or service, because they are presented with results that, precisely because they're not typical, that's where the false purchase comes into play, which is why that's not sufficient. So I encourage all of you as consumers to always read those types of disclosures. And if you see something like results not typical, do not purchase that product. And if you are a company that is advertising, please stay clear of this type of strategy. It will land you in trouble in Puerto Rico. Disclosures are essential for ads that could be misleading in Puerto Rico, not ads that are literally false. If your ad is literally false because it's unsubstantiated, then you cannot fix it with a disclosure. Disclosures are only applicable to ads that could be misleading, but for the disclosure. So if we include the disclosure, the ad is understood to be a clear and transparent ad for the consumer. And we have 4 requirements for a disclosure that is clear and conspicuous, which is the federal and local requirement of disclosures. The first is prominence. The disclosure has to be big enough for any consumer to notice that it's there and to be able to read. The second is presentation. It has to be worded in a way that an average consumer can understand it. Can't be obscure or complex technical words. Placement. It has to be located in a place where consumers will actually look within the ad. And proximity, that location has to be close to the claim that it modifies or clarifies. So the prominence, it has to be big. You know, if we can go back to that slide for just a second. The prominence, it has to be big enough. The presentation, it has to be easy to read. The placement, it has to be somewhere the consumer will look. And the proximity, it has to be close to that claim that it is clarifying. And I include now in the next slide some examples. They are meant to be funny, of disclosures that will never work. Like I said, if your ad is literally false, there's no disclosure that will fix it. And here we have an ad that says 2 for 1 all day, every day. There's an asterisk. And when you read the asterisk, it says that the actual 2 for 1 is only from 4 to 6. This disclosure is not clear and conspicuous, so your ad is literally false. And I also include another example Sugar that has a label that says sugar free, this label is also unacceptable and it is clearly literally false. They are meant to be funny for purposes of this presentation, but in real life, if you find yourself with something like this as a consumer, you will be confused and or lied to, so they're not acceptable. Digital disclosures are very important nowadays. If you're going to use disclosures through a link, that link must be clear and conspicuous, which means it must meet the standards of the 4 Ps. It must be clearly visible, and once you click on that link, the disclosures must appear instantly. It cannot be that you click a link to then click another link in order to get to your disclosures. Those disclosures have to come up immediately once the link is clicked. Pop-up disclosures are not adequate because some devices no longer accept pop-up disclosures, so the FTC is warning the advertisers to steer clear from pop-up disclosures. And that is it for me for this section, but we will touch briefly in the next section some nice topics about native and social media advertising. Thank you,
Yes.
everybody.
Thank you, Maristella. We are now on to part 2, which focuses on use of celebrities and athletes' images. And for Jamaica and a number of the other countries, this is an evolving area. So we'll first hear from Stephanie about the situation in Trinidad.
Thank you, Dianne. So I'll be very quick with this presentation because there really are no express laws providing for rights of publicity or image rights in Trinidad and Tobago. There are, however, 2 provisions under the Protection Against Unfair Competition Act, which expressly prohibit any act which causes confusion with respect to celebrities, image or goodwill. So any act which a person takes to dilute the goodwill or image of a celebrity, that celebrity can take civil action against the infringer. And what that would look like is a claim in the High Court, where the person would rely on the provisions of the Protection Against Unfair Competition Act, together with passing off, and if applicable, trademark and copyright laws. But there is no local jurisprudence on publicity rights, so Trinidad and Tobago would actually look to precedent elsewhere. For example, I know Jamaica has 1 or 2 laws with respect to with respect to Bob Marley, so that would be of precedent, as well as in Canada or the UK. That is what local courts would look at to determine how to handle or decide on a particular matter. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. I find that quite interesting, especially your Protection Against Unfair Competition Act, which actually speaks to, celebrity or well-known characters. I don't think we have an equivalent provision in our Unfair Competition Act, but over to Rachael to give us more details on that.
All right, thank you. So I'll just be looking at the position in Jamaica on this issue. That picture on the first slide of Usain was one that was highly discussed in the advertising field because, I mean, as you see, it's him, Usain Bolt, winning a race, and there's that lightning bolt in the background, and it was something that a lot of companies were willing to fight over to be able to use in their ads. Next slide, please. So there is no statute in Jamaica related to personality rights or publicity rights, but what we have is some restrictions within the Jamaican Code of Advertising Practice, as well as Stephanie mentioned, there have been a case or 2 related to the tort of misappropriation of personality. So the Jamaican Code of Advertising Practice says that advertisers are prohibited from portraying or referring to any living person without their express permission being obtained first. And this requirement applies to everyone, public figures, foreign nationals, and the regular local Jamaican citizen. And you should take care, again, not to offend any religious beliefs or anything like that. We'll go to the next slide. Right, so this is a case that Stephanie had mentioned, the Robert Marley Foundation against Dina Michelle. And this case departed from the position in the UK, which does not acknowledge an image right for a celebrity, and decided to take the position that a celebrity should have interest in their in their image as a property right separate and apart from a privacy right. So in this case, what happened was that after Bob Marley's death, there was a company that took his image and they were using it on t-shirts and selling them. And these t-shirts were of inferior quality. And Bob Marley's estate sued them for use of his image, particularly because they already had an exclusive license with another company to be using his image on clothing. Next slide, yeah. So while the code itself limits this need to get permission for living persons, this case went even further to say that it doesn't matter if the celebrity is living or not. They have a right to exploit their image. And so it identified that tort of misappropriation of personality. And it's interesting to note that the Privy Council, which is a UK court, is our final court of appeal. And so it would be very interesting to see how it would be treated if this case was ever, if a case similar to this was ever to go as far as the Privy Council, because the UK does not acknowledge an image right. It would be very interesting to see how they treat with it. So it hasn't been affirmed by any appellate courts, but it did open up the way for another case in Jamaica where the court decided that it was going to extend this right and this tort of misappropriation of personality beyond a celebrity and extend it to the everyday Jamaican. So that if your image is used in a way that you did not give permission to, you have a claim to bring against the person who has used it. So just by way of example, telecommunications company Digicel in 2015, they used an image of a student athlete after he won a race, and it was played off as a congratulatory message printed in the national newspapers, full page. But then of course they decided to throw in, here are data plans, here are call plans. And so of course it came off as an advertisement and that this athlete is being sponsored by Digicel. Now his family raised an issue with it because one, they didn't have permission to use his image, and two, it caused problems for him overseas because it jeopardized his chances of getting a scholarship from a US university. So Digicel eventually removed all social media posts and apologized to the family publicly and wrote to the university to let them know that they are not sponsoring him. So this is just some examples of the proper ways that advertisers use celebrity and athlete images. All of these companies sponsor these respective athletes. They have agreements with them to use their image. And it's something we see every Olympics, that it becomes a problem where companies like to take these images of these athletes and tell them congrats while also slapping their logos and information about their company on these congratulatory messages, which of course is not allowed. And just last Olympics, Usain Bolt actually himself warned athletes to be aware of things like this. Don't let companies take advantage of your brand or your image and to know that you're worth. So something to think about. And another interesting case, and I'm really not picking on Digicel, but they've given us some material to work with. As you know, track and field is a big deal in Jamaica. And so it starts from high school. We have these boys and girls athletic championships where people go and they try to identify the next big Olympic stars. So it's a very big deal here. And one of the main sponsors, was Digicel's competitor, Lime, another telecommunications company. So Lime was a title sponsor for these championships. And after winning a race, athlete Michael O'Hara removed his jersey, and underneath his jersey was the Digicel tagline, "Be Extraordinary," in the colors red and green. Green is the color of his school, Calabar, and red, of course, is Digicel's color. So this was a big deal because Lime was the title sponsor for this event and Digicel is their direct competitor. And later that same day, the company announced that he was their newest brand ambassador. And this was how they chose to reveal that. And so ISA, who is responsible for organizing this event, had to come up with a new policy to stop any form of ambush marketing. And by doing that, they implemented some consequences for the schools and the athletes. If they participate in any activity like that again, they face up to 3 years suspension from this event, which is a serious penalty for them. And every year now they give a warning to say anybody that tries anything like this again, we're coming after you to the full extent that we can. Right, so that's it for me.
Thanks, Rachel. Now Jaime is going to give us the landscape in relation to use of athletes in
Thank you.
advertising.
Thank you, Diane. I just want to remember that we are in the Caribbean relax mode, and even though you see books in the others presentations and offices, but we are here. Remember that it's Caribbean, no problem, like we say in T-shirts, Dominican Republic or Sosua Punta Cana, no problem. And we have more or less the same things in like in the other countries or the other jurisdictions you have seen. We don't have an express advertising law, but we do have basic rules on unfair competition, against unfair competition and misleading advertising in the Dominican Republic. We do have rules for minors, and very important, puffery is permitted, and it is not considered unfair competition. Having said that, I would like to talk something about the right of image in the Dominican Republic, which is not a right for only for celebrities. It is for everyone, every person in the Dominican Republic, as since 2010, and it has been elevated to a constitutional right. Before, in 1986, up to this moment, it was only on the copyright law, which is it is today, and but it was about the use in commerce of the image, not any kind of use, which since 2010 is like that. And it is interesting to say that in any part of the law, obviously not in the Constitution, it doesn't have a limit in time. So maybe we don't have expiration of right of image rights in the Dominican Republic. We have to consider that it will be the largest or the longest expiration, which is 20 years in the Dominican Republic. It is the other slide, please. The other slide before. Okay, and we have to say that the image, it is permitted if it's taken in a public event, educational event. That is a tricky part, and you can use that image. But remember, do not use in the commerce. If you use in commerce, like advertising, then it will not be only talking about the public event or education. It's a commercial use. And also, just a quick point of image in the Dominican Republic, courts have recognized that the image is anything that could describe the person, that if you identify that person, it is considered that the image is has been used. Okay, what you see, the other, sorry, the other. What you see on the slide is a publication from the private sector, that helps the government through an organization for the training and the participation of the athletes in the international events. In the Dominican Republic, not as Jamaica, but we had a very, and we consider excellent participation, and even in a track and field part, and we were we had several medals on that. So if the congratulations are done by this organization, as you see in this slide, it's permitted. But please, the other slide. But we had tons of advertising from companies that they might not have the authorization for doing that advertising and using the image. Obviously, that will be considered a violation of the rights of the athletes, of the image of the rights of image, and also an unfair competition for them. And we have to say that social media exploded. So those are examples from regular media, newspapers. But social media, you can name any dozens, I think that hundreds of companies and profiles were congratulating the athletes using any kind of photographs and images from those companies. Obviously, if it's a person, maybe that wouldn't matter. But if it's a celebrity that is using that, it's an influencer that is using the image, or a big company or a small company that is using the image, that will be unfair competition. And please, the other slide. We have in the Dominican Republic, talking about the right of image, a very interesting thing. Last year, the Supreme Court of Justice, yes, in the pandemic, during the pandemic, the Supreme Court of Justice decided on a very interesting case that it was about who can decide the image for publication in these international events. And for example, what about if it's a team, a volleyball team, and that was the case. Every person has the personal right and has to grant it or license specifically to the association or the federations that they are part for going through to these games. And the association, even only for being associated, only for organizing the events, even this organization that I mentioned, that it's a coordination with the private sector, they do not have the right if expressly it's not given by the athletes. And that's all from the Dominican Republic in the image rights.
Thank you very much, Jaime. Very interesting. Maristella.
Thank you, Dianne. So hi, everybody. Welcome back to Puerto Rico. So in Puerto Rico, the social media marketing is also known as native advertising. This is primarily regulated by the Federal Trade Commission guides that they have published. We call the Federal Trade Commission the FTC. So we have three important guides that regulate what is known as native advertising, and that's the deceptively formatted advertisement guide, the use of endorsement and testimonials and advertising guide, and the .com disclosures guide. So those are the three guides that we need to keep paying attention to when we are talking about native advertising. And you'll ask yourselves, what is native advertising? It's any type of advertising that is sort of masked as something that is organic. For example, an ad that is an article in a newspaper or a magazine. Typically, those articles would be organic from that newspaper or magazine, but nowadays they can be sponsored or paid for by companies. So that's a type of native advertising. The other type is used in social media, the famous influencers when they do a story about a product. That type of story can be organic because the influencer likes or enjoys the product, but it can also be paid. And if it's paid, it's a native advertisement because it's disguised as something that would natively or organically occur. Okay, so that can also happen with emails. It can happen with placements in radio. For example, there's a radio show going on and all of a sudden we have a representative from a company, let's just say company X. Oh, we just happen to have such and such from company X today, and we want to talk about your health today. Tell me what's important about health to keep, aware nowadays, and the person will go on and talk about their products or their services. That can be organic because the radio station wants to touch upon that subject and invites a person specialized in the area, but it can also be paid. So anything that can be organic but can also be paid is categorized as native advertising in the United States and in Puerto Rico. And it's regulated by the FTC, as I said. It has to be disclosed that it's an ad, that it's been paid, that it's been sponsored. And the way the FTC has issued guides in terms of what is the adequate disclosure as to payment, we're going to look in the next slide, but it's basically the word ad, the phrase paid advertisement, the phrase sponsored advertising content. You can even use sponsored. Some companies use SP as an abbreviation to sponsored when you have a limited number of characters available. I don't encourage the use of SP because it can be confusing or misleading for a less educated consumer. So I prefer, if you only have those very limited spaces, just use ad, which every typical consumer can understand it's been paid for. The FTC does not recommend the use of promoted or promoted stories because promoted is understood to be something that can also be organic and not paid for. It can lead to confusion between consumers, so it's not approved by the FTC. So again, disclosures are ad, advertisement, paid advertisement, sponsored advertisement. Any of the above can work in terms of letting the consumer know that there has been an exchange of, be that money or in-kind products or services for that feature, for that story, for that article, so that the consumer can make its own conclusions as to how much weight they will give to that ad. Okay, so that's really important that it's disclosed, that it's promoted. And as we will see in the next slide, there's the first case of native advertising that the FTC made public was in 2015. A very well-known national retailer called Lord & Taylor was the object of that case. Unfortunately, Lord & Taylor entered into an agreement with various well-known influencers at the time and various well-known magazines. They wanted to promote a new line of dresses that they were going to be launching into market. And in the next slide, we see an example of one of those advertisements made by those influencers. In this case, this influencer in particular, her name is Ariel Sharness. She's very, very well known in the United States, one of the many influencers hired by Lord & Taylor. And in their agreements with these influencers, they were paid both in kind and monetarily. Lord & Taylor did not include any requirement of disclosures in their stories or in their ads. As you can see from the caption in this Instagram story, there was no disclosure that it was a paid advertisement. So that's where Lord & Taylor gets into trouble. They even reviewed all these posts prior to they being made by the influencers. And in their reviews, they never required the influencers to disclose that it was a paid ad or sponsored content. So this is where the FTC comes in. And they start an internal administrative proceeding. It's an alternative the FTC can do. They can take you to court, but they can also handle those matters through an administrative complaint, which is what they did. I have additional examples in the next slides of other influencers that made the same mistake. As you can see from the caption, no disclosure as to paid content. And here we have an example of one of the articles that were paid for by Lord & Taylor in a very well-known magazine in the United States called Nylon. As you can see from the slide for Nylon, there's no disclosure that it was a paid article. So a regular reader might think it was an organic article, and it was not. Therefore, that was the false and deceptive element that the FTC claimed. The case settled, and Lord and Taylor paid a fine privately with the FTC. But it was the first big example of native advertising done wrong. So it's sort of the hallmark case in the United States for native advertising. Nowadays, Instagram has some features that when you post a story and it's paid, you can actually select that it's a paid story through a methodology in Instagram. So we are improving in this for compliant purposes, but we still have a lot of influencers and a lot of athletes and artists that don't comply with this. So it's important to get the word out. So I think that is it for me for this section. So thank you again for everything and for your attention, and I will touch base in the next section.
Thank you so much, Maristella. Very interesting examples, and to see how for Puerto Rico, you do have the regulations of the FTC to sort of keep everybody in check in terms of advertising.
Yes. They are
now,
actually for Puerto Rico regulations because our local entities aren't as up to speed with the times, unfortunately, as the FTC is. So the fact that we have that as guidance really does help us in aiding our clients in their ads.
Yes, wonderful. So we're sort of switching topics now, and I know we're close to midday, but we are going to be going a little bit over the hour, so just bear with us for a few more minutes as we speak about well, Jaime has a few words about social marketing, and then we're going to be talking about sweepstakes and promotions. So Jaime, just speak about
yes, don't worry that I'm going to be very, very short, which please pass your slide, and we can go to the other we can go to the other slide, and that will be it. Everything that you heard from Puerto Rico, everything that you heard from FTC, that will be considered the best practices anywhere, and also in Dominican Republic. But the real thing is that in Dominican Republic, there are no rules. So influencers, they do not say paid advertising. They don't say promoted. They don't say that I received financial aid, nothing. People just know that they are paid by these companies. Obviously, there is a lot of unfair competition because there are many ways that these influencers, they say they try something and they haven't tried, and obviously that will be even a misleading advertising. And I won't say more than that. And for the Dominican Republic.
Yes, thank you so much, Jaime. Now we're moving on to, I think Karyl has a couple of things to say about social media and marketing as well. That's for the Dutch Caribbean. So Karyl.
Thank you, Dianne. In the Dutch Caribbean, there is no specific law for social media. So we look at the e-commerce legislation for transmitting commercial communication across any forms of electronic means that is targeted at the conclusion of an electronic agreement. We also look at the provisions of the civil code and intellectual property and privacy with regard to advertising via social media. There are a couple of rules according to the e-commerce legislation in the Dutch Caribbean. So the advertiser must be clearly identified, and particularly when it regards unsolicited commercial communication, that must be clear and simply a way to protest against the unsolicited commercial communication, and such as must also be recognizable as such. The special requirements that apply are that the contact details of the advertiser must be mentioned, the mercantile registration, and a clear indication of the product and services and the price and costs. If it regards special offers such as discounts, prizes, and gifts, those must be clearly identified as such, and the conditions for eligibility must be able to be fulfilled easily. So that applies for the Dutch Caribbean. So it's just the e-commerce legislation that we're looking at there.
Thank you very much, Karyl. We're going to get some top tips in relation to sweepstakes and promotions, and we're going to start with Mandisa from Trinidad and Tobago.
Hi. Okay, so in Trinidad, we can go to the first slide, right? So in Trinidad and Tobago, gambling, lotteries, and betting are all governed by the Gambling and Betting Act. The definition of gamble and lottery really means a game of chance for winnings in money or money's worth. The law basically says that all lotteries, except for certain stated exceptions, and there are actually only 3 limited exceptions, are unlawful. It's important to note, because of the use of the game of chance in the definitions, what a game of chance is. And a game of chance, as defined, includes a game of chance and skill combined, but it does not mean a game of skill alone, and athletic games and sports are specifically excluded. So the takeaway is that generally all lotteries, which are games of chance for winnings or money's worth, are unlawful. Next slide, please. Notwithstanding the general prohibition against lotteries, the Gambling and Betting Act expressly allows and regulates something called a contest. So a contest basically is a competition organized as a sales promotion activity where prizes are distributed by chance or lot. And the sales promotion activity is basically an activity that stimulates the purchase of goods from a business. By expressly allowing and making contests lawful, the Gambling and Betting Act makes a distinction between a commercial marketing device that utilizes competitions to induce further purchases, which is a lawful activity, from generally activities that fall within the definition of lottery, which are unlawful. And it regulates, the Gambling and Betting Act regulates such commercial marketing devices by imposing a prerequisite that the permission of the National Lotteries Control Board be obtained for the promotion of such contests. Next, right, we're on the right slide. The National Lotteries Control Board is a statutory body that is otherwise responsible for managing national lotteries. So that is the lotto and the scratch games that the government handles. But under the Gambling and Betting Act, the responsibility of the National Lotteries Control Board is to grant permission for these sales promotion activities. If you don't get promotion, sorry, can you go back to the last slide, please? If you do not get the permission, it's a criminal offense and you're liable to a fine of 100,000 Trinidad and Tobago dollars or imprisonment for 2 years. And the Act provides that the NLCB will grant permission to promote a contest only in cases where the contest is related to the purchase of goods and services. And this really goes back to the recognition of the commercial marketing device that is really used to promote purchases from businesses. So contests are commonly used in Trinidad by various industries, manufacturing, retail, financial sector. And they're also very common around certain seasons. So July, August is the back to school season. We have Christmas, we have Carnival. You have a lot of promotions around those seasons. I just want to leave with drawing your attention to a particular, what I think is an interesting case. And currently, there is a large financial institution in Trinidad, which also has presence up in the Caribbean islands, has a vaccination lottery program. It was launched in September and it's running until December. And this was with the approval of the NLCB. Next slide, please. What is interesting about this case is that the prizes depend on the level of vaccination achieved by the country. So if the country achieves 70% vaccination, the grand prize would be 2 vehicles. But if we only achieve 50% vaccination, only 1 vehicle, and they call it actually a consolation prize. And the other interesting thing about this is that it's actually open to all adults over 18 Trinidad and Tobago nationals. So it's not limited to the customers or the clients of the financial institution. So I thought it was interesting because I don't know on what basis the NLCB actually granted this, gave permission for this, because I don't think it's in furtherance of business activity. And before I leave, I'll just remind you that Stephanie, when she spoke about the advertising standards of Trinidad that are best practices, there are specific advertising standards with respect to advertisements that promote a contest, which include that they will state rules and the conditions for the governing entry into same and when the contest would be closed. And the NLCB, when they grant permission to promote a contest, they as well would impose certain conditions for promoting same. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mandisa. We have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask the panelists to keep your presentations quite tight as we move to Rachael from Jamaica.
All right, thank you. So I'll just quickly take us through this part. So the legal framework in Jamaica is the Betting, Gaming and Lotteries Act, which is governed by the Betting, Gaming and Lotteries Commission. That's the overseeing entity. The BGLC is the only entity that has the authority to approve these prize competitions. Next slide. So any type of prize competition is governed by the BGLA, the Betting, Gaming and Lotteries Commission, and that it has to be done either in media, print or electronic, or in connection with a trade or business, or the sale of an article to the public. So there has to be an entrance fee, a stake, contribution, subscription, something for the right to enter or participate. In order to do a competition like this, you have to have permission from the BGLC, and it's obtained by submitting an application at least 14 days before you start promoting this competition. So just looking at some material that has to be included in any ads for these promotions: the name of the competition. The Betting, Gaming and Lotteries Commission recommends that you avoid terms like raffle, jackpot, and sweepstakes. So we generally say promotions used, or just competition. And the details of the rules. So you have to include, are there any contributions required to participate? Are there any age restrictions? Do you need to be 18 and over? If you have to purchase goods to participate, how many goods, what range, what frequency? All those little rules need to be included. Any information that you need to be providing to complete an entry. If there's any skill involved, how many winners there will be, how frequently you draw a winner, and your method of selecting a winner. Next slide. Any reasons that you would be excluded from entry, any entities that will be facilitating this competition, you have to give their names and their address, a closing date. If there's no closing date, then you need to say what the conditions are, if there are any conditions. So while stocks last, for example. Put all the rules in clear language. If there's any ambiguity, it will be interpreted in favor of the participant rather than the entity giving the promotion. Make sure that the rules are easily accessible. Constantly remind people where they can go to find the rules, when you will be selecting a winner, how you're going to notify the winner, what prizes will be given, and how you go about claiming your prize. So these ads that I've included, just in the interest of time, will be circulated to the participants rather than playing them now. But it's a recent trend that we've noticed here in Jamaica, where these promotions are done by social media dance challenges, where these companies hire a social media influencer as well as a local artist to use their music. So in this ad, we had the social media influencer teaching the dance moves. So it's instructions on how to do the dance. And then on the next slide is actual entries to the competition. And you'll see what Maristella mentioned, that paid partnership with Grace Foods. Grace Kennedy was the company that was doing this promotion, and you have to incorporate their products into this. And we've seen a lot of companies doing this recently, where they do these dance challenges. And even on the slide, you can see a lot of the rules have been placed here just to comply with all these requirements under the Act. So what's the prize, how you have to do it, and certain conditions like your profile has to be public. So that's just an interesting trend that will be circulated to you all.
Yes, and certainly interesting to watch. Sorry, we can't play it here, but when it's circulated, hopefully you could open up a link and see that. Over to you, Karyl.
Thank you, Dianne. Promotion contests and sweepstakes in the Dutch Caribbean, they are not required to be registered with any entity. However, practice does show that a notary is usually present at the drawing as in order to ascertain the identity of the winners as a guarantee to the public that the drawing is legit. The terms and conditions are considered general terms and conditions of contract, so that means that they must be physically handed over to the participants or they must be easily accessible and downloadable. There is no government permit required for skill-based promotions, but there is a government permit required for chance-based promotions. But no government permit is required if it is organized by a commercial organization or a company to stimulate the sale or to increase turnover. And the second condition is that the participant is not required to pay a monetary amount as a condition to participate. I must mention that bingo is explicitly regulated in the Dutch Caribbean, and also that charitable sweepstakes are allowed, but they are not allowed to be organized by companies, but only by associations and foundations that have that as a part of their articles of incorporation.
Thanks, Karyl. We're going to move quickly to Maristella and wrap up with Jaime.
So thank you, Dianne. Okay, so quickly in the giveaways in Puerto Rico, it's all about the rules. It's very important that we know what are the critical elements to include in our rules. Things such as the start and the end date, the eligibility requirements, the methodologies to participate, and you must always include a free way to participate in any sweepstake or giveaway. It must be there otherwise you're going to get in trouble, specifically with a local entity, the regulatory government entity, DACO. Okay, so other important elements to keep in mind that I just want to briefly mention in the next slide are that the rules should be published in the same language in which the ads are made. That can be English or Spanish. The important thing is that they are uniformly made, the ads and the rules, and the time limit to claim the prizes are also essential. You would need to include price descriptions, particularly models, colors, worth in the market. You need to select both winners and alternate winners in the same selection method. You need to clearly display where they can participate, who is the promoter, that includes name, address, contact information, where and when you can go and get your prize, in addition to the time frame to claim that prize. And also, it's very important if you want to make changes or modifications to your sweepstakes or your giveaway rules, you have to have authorization from DACO. It's not automatic. You have to have that authorization. It could be an implied authorization. There are some particularities for that implied authorization, but you have to provide notice of that change or modification you wish to do. And afterwards, you must notify to the public in the same way in which you advertise your sweepstakes or giveaways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maristella. That sounds pretty clear. Easy. Seems to be less complicated than Jamaica. Jaime?
Yes, this was very good organized, because everything that happens in Puerto Rico are more or less the same rules that in the Dominican Republic. And you have to be very specific on that. Only to mention that it is very important. If you want to do a promotion of sweepstakes in the Dominican Republic, you must register with the Consumer Protection. And they are tricky with the language. We have to review the language. Even though it's the same thing that you want to say, you have to put in a specific way or in a Spanish language. We have an issue with withholding taxes in the Dominican Republic. That's why the sweepstakes and promotions should be through a Dominican company or using some company or some person that does business in the Dominican Republic. The right of image, it is limited. You cannot be for all the time. And the jurisdiction has to be in the Dominican Republic. And yes, we accept skill-based and chance-based promotions in the Dominican Republic. And that's all, folks.
Wow, thank you so much, Jaime. And we are actually at the end of the webinar. I have not really seen any other questions. I know some panelists got direct questions, but I just want to direct you to the Gala website where we have our resources. We have news, events, publications, and also the Gala blog. You'll be hearing more about this webinar on the blog. And of course, the presentation will be circulated and made available to all participants. I also want to just say a thank you again to all our panelists. And if you need advice and information on anything in relation to advertising in the Caribbean, this is your go-to team. So thank you all for coming. And as I said, you'll see the email addresses. You can reach out directly, and we will answer or try to answer all of your questions. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.